That then brings me, thank you for that, that brings me rapidly on to our main item of business and the reason we're all gathered here today. And that, of course, is to listen to Alderman and Sheriff Michael Manelli, a very distinguished historian, who is going to be talking, you can see on the screen, he's going to be talking to us about the economics of Thames sailing barges. The subtitle is An Unwonted View of the City of London's Commercial Prosperity. And so, without any further ado, I'm going to pass the baton straight over to Michael. Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you, President, fellow historians, ladies and gentlemen. The economics of Thames sailing barges, an unwanted view of the City of London's commercial prosperity. I've always loved this quote from Sir Walter Raleigh. There are two things scarce matched in the universe, the sun in heaven and the Thames on earth. And today I will ask you to focus on an overlooked bit of London's unwanted history. Unwanted in the sense of unusual or unaccustomed. We're going to examine the 17th through 19th century equivalent of lorries, the Thames sailing barges. We're going to highlight their overlooked economic importance, and my conclusion will be that London's geography shaped London's destiny perhaps more than social historians might appreciate. Thames sailing barges were the mechanism by which Londoners took advantage of that geography. Now, my background to this subject is most influenced by the fact that my wife, Elizabeth, who's online today, and I owned and proudly restored a Thames sailing barge over 21 years, from 1996 to 2017, sailing barge Lady Daphne. I, in fact, have worn this shirt in honor. It's not casual, it's formal uniform. And I, in fact, have behind me a model of that ship as well. But in addition, I have been a trustee since 1999 of the oldest racing body in the world, actually, the Thames Match, as well as being a member of the Association of Bargemen, Sailing Barge Association, Thames Sailing Barge Trust, and Company of Watermen and Lightermen. And further, thanks to historian Galloway, I served as a London Waterways Commissioner for 8 years. Oh, and on plastic boats, I'm a long-standing racer and member of the Royal Ocean Racing Club. So I can get quite passionate about barges, not least racing one of them less than a fortnight ago. And to some degree, this passion makes me push some unwanted arguments, but hopefully you should have no need to take this talk with a pinch of salt water. Now, a wonderful 1984 book on the Thames Barrier by Stuart Gilbert and Ray Horner initially struck me as rather pretentious, by beginning with the Thames in Roman times. However, they convinced me that this is the right place to start today, the Roman conquest of Britain in 43 AD. The Thames is the largest river basin in southeast England, pointing back to Rome. It has a high tidal range of 7 meters. Of the Thames' 346 kilometers, 160 kilometers is tidal, close to half. Along its tidal stretch, the river bottom is almost all mud. In other words, a flat-bottomed vessel can sit safely without overturning or being pierced by rocks or stones. In Roman times, the eastern Thames was much broader. Salt marshes, particularly to the east of today's city, absorbed much of the tidal waters. The Thames flowed more slowly. Today's swifter Thames, flowing back and forth at about 4 knots, is due to containment and scouring, reinforced by containment. The Thames estuary itself is full of tight creeks and mudflats, providing access to farms. Now, as historians will know, London was founded in 48 AD. The Romans built on Cornhill and Ludgate Hill to take advantage of both high ground and fresh water. More important may have been that London was the furthest east they could construct a bridge connecting Kent and Essex using the technology of the time, saving days of travel. London Bridge was erected in 52 AD, and by 60 AD, London was the largest and most important city in Britain. Though London was destroyed in 60 or 61 AD, the Romans remained convinced of London's future and rebuilt, and London remained the center of Roman operations till they ceased direct control of Britain around 410 AD. Barges first get a mention in the building of London Wall. To a sailor, barge, strictly, just means without a keel, flat-bottomed. The Romans would steer these barges full of stone, floating upriver on one tide, then anchor, sit on the mud as the tide drained out, await the turn of the tide, and float upriver again. Now, the Roman wall is about 4 kilometers in length, and the Romans built the landward wall between 190 and 225 AD. The riverside wall between 250 and 270 AD. The Ragstone was quarried near Maidstone in Kent, a 127-kilometer sailing trip up the Medway. It was a massive project. 1 million stone blocks about the size of breeze blocks, 85,000 tons of stone, and approximately 3,000 barge loads for 30-ton barges. So London remained the first point where the tidal Thames was spannable by the technology of the day, such that when stable governance permitted rebuilding in the 9th century, it was pretty much at the same spot. This meant that London Bridge has formed a barrier to sailing ships who can't lower their masts for well over a millennium, right up to the present day. Now, barges remained important. Interestingly, the old Buckerell family property opposite today's Mansion House was known in the 16th and 17th century as the Old Barge on the south side of Bucklersbury, the north side of today's Bloomberg site. Thomas Moore lived at the Barge from 1505 till 1525 before moving to Chelsea. Now, England's maritime myth and England's actual boat building prowess don't really converge until the early 18th century. Henry VIII's Mary Rose, Elizabeth I's deference to Grace O'Malley, an Irish sea pirate, Drake's inability to sink any Spanish ship in direct combat, and the Dutch raid on the Medway in 1667 indicate a nation perhaps a bit less seaworthy than it believed. Stung by the Dutch raid, Charles II and Samuel Pepys revolutionized boat building by importing Dutch designers and shipwrights, particularly for naval construction. And we see the enormous influence of the Dutch on the English in many fundamental sailing terms: deck, keel, skipper, vang, yacht. As the English Navy comes into its period of superiority during the 18th century, quietly and at the same time, the Dutch leave their mark on commercial vessels. For the first time, particularly on the Thames, the English adopt Dutch sailing barge designs for widespread use. Now, for those of you who've observed the Samuels collection at Mansion House, yes, those Dutch paintings show the very vessels the English began copying, the Dutch Spritsail rigs, at the very time the English began copying them. Now, the Spritsail rig consists of a mast with a permanent sprit, or sprit. It's mounted at about 60 degrees vertical. The sail is stowed by being brailed into the sprit, a bit like an old cinema curtain. And this contrasts completely with a gaff rig, which is more like raising or lowering a telephone pole perpendicular to the mast for each sailing. However, the English were not constrained by narrow Dutch canals, so they built larger, longer, and wider. So the Thames sailing barge economic characteristics are: it's flat-bottomed with a small draft, typically less than 4 feet, so able to work in shallow water, safe on mud and blocks, but in consequence, it needs lead boards to sail. The Spritsail rig allows the main and mizzen masts to be dropped and thus able to shoot under bridges. The sail handling is safer and easier without a boom. It's loose-footed, more maneuverable with a mizzen and rudder connection. Winches improve the economics enormously. One person can brail the sails and wind up the lee board. And horses mean the sails are self-tacking, so 2 people can crew a large boat that would take 6 to 8 on a similar-sized gaff rig. Now today there are about 45 remaining hulls, but only about 20 Thames sailing barges are in raceable condition around the UK. And with a few charming exceptions, such as the tiny barge Signet, Thames barges range from 50 to 100 registered tons, that is their volume, and up to 250 deadweight tons, that is the weight they can carry. They range from 80 to 95 feet long and are about 21 feet wide. Their 3,500 square foot ochre sail plan was highly distinctive, as recorded in numerous London paintings and early photographs, university logos, bus company logos, wind vanes. For the illiterate, paintings of Nelson's 1806 funeral procession have a spritsail rig up in the top left corner to let them know that's London. Now, the heyday of sailing barges was the 18th and 19th century. The rig design was so stable that bargemen could board a new vessel in the middle of the night and find everything in the same place. Thames barges sailed throughout the south and east coast, from the Scillies to Newcastle, as well as conducting a thriving trade with the continent. And in fact, in one year, we took Lady Daphne well over 600 miles to Brest. Their principal cargoes were grain, hay, or other bulk foodstuffs, bricks and other building materials, and basically anything that needed to move between East Coast farms and the metropolis. As these were almost the world's first one-design boats, barges were, interestingly, raced extensively. Records of barge racing start in Harwich in 1844. Henry Dodd was the inspiration for the Golden Dustman in Our Mutual Friend. He was a contractor of City Wharf, New North Road, Hoxton, and a good acquaintance of Dickens. Born in 1801, he started his working life as a ploughboy in the fields within sight of St. Paul's. By 1836, he had become a very successful scavenger, a refuse collector, and Dodd seized this rubbish business opportunity by purchasing a fleet of sailing barges. The rubbish also fired brickworks he owned. He became very wealthy. He was the Eddie Stobart of 19th century barges, a true riches from rags story. He also became a member of the Metropolitan Board of Works and was a freeman of the Butchers' Company. And in 1863, with the support of the Prince of Wales Yacht Club, Henry Dodd proposed the Thames Match, a 48-mile course from Erith to the Nore. Today it's run from Gravesend to beyond Southend and back. Dodd wished to show, in his own words, the value of the races, not only as sporting events, but as a means of advertising their usefulness as a means of transport and bringing to the public eye a better picture of what a sailing barge can do in the way of speed. Think lorries at Silverstone. Now, many in society assumed that the event had royal patronage, something Dodd did little to discourage, but in fact the yacht club was named after an Erith pub, the Prince of Wales. If alive today, Dodd would probably have a ferry contract with Chris Grayling. Now, the Thames Match remains. It's the oldest continuous sailing race in the world. The America's Cup did begin in 1851, but then took a 19-year holiday till its second match, with constant revisions since to the boats and the rules. Racing led to the last sailing barge development in the 1880s, which was racing lee boards, hydrodynamically shaped boards that push the boat upwind, akin to a rear wing on a Formula One car. And when racing, free the wang, keep the horse clear, babies below, and shall I serve lunch before the next tack, are not the sort of phrases one expects to hear during a yacht race. However, this is fairly common racing patter in the midst of a barge match. Now, these economics filtered down to skippers and crew. Barge skippers were highly respected community members, independent business people capable of a multitude of tasks, as well as running a sensible business. Their wives frequently crewed with them or shipped along for company. Crew members were well paid with by the standards of the time, solid employment prospects. An entry-level boy of 14 was paid only slightly less than an entry-level bank clerk in the city, but had room and board as well. But it's the tides that matter. Now, the Mediterranean is a salt lake with no tide to speak of. Most Western European rivers have tidal sections that are quite short. If you concede that the Bristol Channel points the wrong way, London is the only major European city other than Hamburg on an extensive tidal river. But Hamburg didn't control the Dutch or Danish surrounds, while London controlled Suffolk, Kent, and Essex. Now, the Thames estuary is noted as well for experiencing mostly southwesterly winds. This means sailing out of London is easy, as it is easy to navigate north to Essex and Suffolk or south to Kent. Yet everything floating upriver winds up in the Pool of London. And on a tidal river, this gives the ability to work against the prevailing winds. It means that loads from the rich farmlands of Kent, Essex, and Suffolk can be in the capital within 2 working days. Thames sailing barges were the only technology at the time capable of feeding a metropolis before the advent of the railways. As late as 1903, a joint select committee of the Lords and Commons estimated that 75 to 80% of the whole traffic of London was carried by barges. I do wonder if they may have been mixing up a little bit barges and lighters, but even so, you can see that for centuries, London had a tidal transport system before switching to lorries. Now, in 1910, as they're coming off stream, there were still 31 boat and barge builders listed just in London and 113 lighterage concerns. Estimates of the number of barges built over the centuries range up past 25,000, and at any one time, it's probable that about 10,000 were trading. In 1854, the Merchant Shipping Act introduced official numbers for newly registered ships, but barges fell in a gray area, especially those involved in upriver trade. In 1910, there were still 2,100 on the Merchant Navy Register, but many were deliberately kept off register. And from the turn of the century, of course, the lorry was intense competition. Numbers of barges began declining such that by the end of World War I, there were about 1,650 registered in trade. And by the beginning of World War II, probably only 600 remain. Again, registered numbers and actual numbers differ widely. Photographic evidence from the Pool of London appears to indicate significant numbers of commercial vessels outside the Merchant Navy Register. The last wooden barges were built in the 1920s, the last steel barges in the 1930s. And the barges themselves contributed to this steep decline, having dug their own graves by carrying the materials which built the roads for the lorries which replaced them. Even so, Bill Fraser kindly pointed out that his father worked for a lighterage company, the Transport Development Group, run by Philip Henman, and that floated on the London Stock Exchange as late as 1950, with 167 barges listed in its accounts amongst its assets. Well, cut to the chase is a sailing term from the tea trade. Merchant vessels would give chase to leave port early and arrive first by setting up the anchor line and rigging so that by cutting those, the vessel could depart immediately. We could talk about characters in the trade, the merchant owners, the industrial safety issues, the role of women, the per vessel economics, sailing terms, or even links with the economics of the canals. But we have little time. So cutting to the chase, London is for 3 centuries the only major city using barges for the bulk of its transport. It's really the first sustainable transport city in the world. By using barges, London had developed a way to outgrow the limitations of ox carts. The permanent sprit, combined with an early but efficient winching system, gave the barges their distinct advantage, an ability to carry around 200 tons of cargo with 2 crew, or as the phrase went, a man, a boy, and a dog. When this cargo capacity and speed are contrasted with, say, 200 ox carts and drivers, the advantages are clear. By my calculations, one boat and 2 men equals 200 ox carts and 200 men, and quite a few boys. At 25 to 75 miles per boat day versus 15 to 20 per ox day, the tonnage mile per man per day ratio is 5,000 to 18. More simply, a 278 to 1 advantage in favor of barges. Now, using early computer spatial models back in the late 1970s, I contributed to a UN project trying to estimate how African cities based around the ox cart could feed themselves. Such projects are rife with assumptions, but our basic conclusion was in line with medieval experience. Perhaps 250,000 to 750,000 people, call it 500,000 midpoint. And at this point, you can't get enough material in to feed the oxen inside the city and remove their waste. At a stretch, Rome in its heyday had just under 1 million people, but rather widespread, and that included all the way down the Tiber to Ostia. Now, in 1500, Beijing, the world's largest city, has 670,000 people. London, under 50,000. Then London grows to 200,000 in 1600, 600,000 in 1700, 1 million in 1800, and as we well know, London enters the 19th century as the largest city in Europe, overtakes Beijing within 2 decades, exceeds 2 million in 1850, and ends the century with 6.5 million people, without question, the largest city in the world. And yet, as the Select Committee reports, in 1903, over 75% of the traffic is largely propelled by the tide. Well, not so fast, Michael. Surely London's size is due to the empire. Revisionists have opened our eyes to the importance of trade amongst the empire's countries, but we're talking here about the unique ability to feed and water the world's largest concentration of people for over a century. But surely the canals, well, canals had a very low penetration rate in London and a minimal economic impact. But surely the railways that stormed over the canals. Well, the London and Greenwich Railway opened in London between 1836 and 1838. At this point, London is now over 2 million people. And railways helped population growth, and in particular the development of the suburbs, but it was the barges that made breaking the population records possible. In some respects, barges are responsible for the parlous state of British railway infrastructure. As evidenced in railway prospectuses of the 1840s and 1850s, anticipated revenues came from passengers and post, not so much freight. Most railways were built accordingly, for speed without freight top of the mind, perhaps with the notable exception of Brunel. Meanwhile, on the continent, which had no two-way barge traffic, railways were built much heavier to handle freight. New York, a riverine port with tide, but not the estuarial geometry to take advantage of it, doesn't really take off until the railways assist. Well, looking to the future, I'd like to make 2 points before closing. The first is that this story might, just might, not be over. A few new barges have been built, 2 without engines, to trade, the wooden Cambria and the steel Blue Mermaid. Blue Mermaid is owned by Sea Change Sailing Trust to help build self-reliance and teamwork among disadvantaged youths by learning how to trade on an old sailing vessel with real cargoes. And Elizabeth and I support it as patrons. And the City of London has a consultation underway on flooding and the Thames barrier, looking at our sea defenses and the overdue need for reconstruction. The city could make Sugar Quay available again for larger sailing vessels, but equally might find that autonomous vessels are a possibility. Imagine an autonomous fleet, perhaps directionally propelled by storing wave power. As you can see here, there are real devices that do that. Perhaps with some sailing capacity, moving goods from our new combined markets in Dagenham up the river and delivering them as far east as Teddington in a wholly automated way. A pipe dream, perhaps, but the raw power of the Thames lies there unused. The second point is that the field of economic research, particularly around London and barges, is still relatively young. Much more research is needed into this view of the economics of London than I have had available time. But I would like to thank the Guildhall Historical Association for allowing me to share these thoughts with you, in the hope that talks such as this might inspire others to question and probe. May I thank you?
That was absolutely fascinating, Michael. Thank you very much indeed. It's a subject about which I knew absolutely nothing, and I still know very little, but I certainly do know more than I knew previously. And I think it's something that we all should learn more about, because I had absolutely no idea about the economic importance of the barges. So thank you for opening my eyes to that. And can I call upon historian Brian Mooney to move a formal vote of thanks?
President and fellow historians, raised as a deep keel ocean sailor on the East Coast, I was always told not to follow the barge. Their flat bottoms and shallow drafts took them safely through swatches and over mudbanks where we would surely run aground. What a pleasure and privilege, therefore, to follow the skipper of the Thames sailing barge, Lady Daphne, today, as he spliced a truly unwanted but salty yarn about how over many centuries these fine vessels provided the lifeblood of London and victualled our city. As always, and not surprisingly, everything goes back to the Romans. But how interesting to hear that once again we borrowed and adapted from our Dutch cousins. As a keen reader of Dickens, I was also intrigued to learn about the original Mr. Boffin, the King of Rubbish in Our Mutual Friend, a novel which opens on the River Thames by my ward of Queen Hythe. And I was also heartened once again to hear a plea for London to resume looking at the Thames, because London for so many decades has had its back to the Thames. And there is indeed, as Michael says, an awful lot more that we can get from actually using our great river. Well, in dropping anchor and brailing and furling our sails, as Michael would say, can I thank Michael for his scholarly and entertaining talk, and propose, Mr. President, that it be printed and circulated and made available for publication at a later date. Anchors away.
Anchors away, indeed. Thank you very much. Can I ask for the approval of those members present to the proposal that the paper be printed and circulated? And unless I
Agreed.
I think the ayes have it. I don't know if anybody objects, but I'm going to take that, if I may, as agreed. And thank you very much indeed, Brian, for that. That's a very thoughtful response, if I might say. And thank you again to Alderman and Sheriff Michael for a most fascinating talk. It's, as I said, it's a subject I really hadn't been very aware of, and fantastic that you've opened our eyes to it. Thank you very much indeed. And unless there's any other business, may I say thank you to everybody for joining in, and I look forward to seeing you again at our next meeting in October. Thank you all very much indeed.